Okay, everyone, so I know that you're still working on your exam, hopefully. Well, or you could be done, and that would be great. So what we're going to do is we're only going to have one lecture for today, Friday, okay? Because I want you to focus most of your time on your lecture and make sure you get that done okay. If you have any questions, let me know. So of all the planets we have in our solar system, the only one, obviously, that we know for sure has life, of course, is Earth. So Mars is a bit controversial. There's been all sorts of Hollywood movies on it. From what I understand, there isn't really any evidence there. Venus and Jupiter, either don't have an atmosphere, or they're too warm, or there's not enough gravity, at least to have life the way we tend to know it. So what I would like you to do is take a moment and pause lecture, okay? And I want you to write down, what is life? So how do we define life? What do living things do? How do we know something's actually alive? Okay, so what does it mean to be alive? So take a moment, write that down, and when you're ready, start up lecture again. So to be alive the way we define it, first off, you have to be made up of cells. Write this down. Have I mentioned write this down? Write this down. Okay, it has to be made up of cells. Additionally, has to respond to external stimuli. Okay, made up of cells, responds to external stimuli, uses energy from the surroundings. All right. Has a genetic component where traits can be passed on from one generation to the next. Okay, so made up of cells, responds to external stimuli, has a metabolism, uses energy, okay, and has a heritable or genetic component. You guys might have come up with a couple of other ideas too, and that's great. So, but what this tells us is kind of what we're looking for as we go to these other planets. In addition to that, how do you find the oldest evidence of life? Okay, how can you tell when life began? It's not like there was a sign in the fossil record saying life started here. Okay, and you can also probably imagine that initially life was pretty small, and it was in the form of very, very tiny single-celled critters. Okay, so if we look at our trusty figure here, and you've seen this several times, we know that the Earth began about 4.6 billion years ago. Okay, but life didn't get interesting. It took quite a while. All right, now life has been around for several billion years in the form of single-celled critters, but it didn't turn into multi-celled critters with all sorts of different body forms until later. But again, initially it started out very simple, okay, single-celled. How in the world do you find that in the fossil record when you're not even sure what you're looking for? So what scientists have focused their time on is looking for what are known as cryptozoic rocks, okay? And of course, crypto means hidden, and zoic means life, animal life, okay? So cryptozoic rocks. And so these are rocks that are difficult to find. You can imagine that most of the rocks that were around in the very beginning of the Earth were actually destroyed due to plate tectonic activity and so forth. And so probably what you're going to look for actually is rocks that found their way to becoming part of sedimentary rocks, if anything. All right, and again, this is not an easy thing to find. I can tell y'all, I do not have the patience for this, okay? So those scientists that do, I would not be one of them. It's a very, very interesting field, but you really got to have a lot of patience, and you really got to be able to look through microscopes for a very long time. So there's an area in Australia known as the North Pole. And you can imagine that it was named that because of the fact that there was a lot of tectonic activity, and at one point in time, that's where it was located, okay? Also magnetic flipping around and so forth with regards to the Earth, but that's why they call it that. Now, this particular rock outcrop, the name is Warrawoona, and don't panic because you're going to see it in the next slide. But what I want you to know from it is that this particular rock outcropping is incredibly old, one of the oldest we have, and potentially one of the first lines of evidence of life. So this rock group, and you see it spelled here. I'm not talking about music either. Sorry, I had to do that. Anyway, outcropping of rocks is approximately 3.5 billion years old. Okay, realize that it's been altered by heat and pressure. So by the way, what type of rock does that make it if it's altered by heat and pressure? Metamorphic, right? Does that sound familiar? I hope. Okay, however, what's interesting about this particular rock formation is that it really contains some of the first evidence of early life. And so if you look to the right, you can see at the very bottom what some people perceive to be evidence of fossils of bacteria and potentially algae. Realistically speaking, this is not easy, by the way, guys. And as I said, I could never actually work in this particular field because you're looking for these tiny, tiny little, fossils of bacteria. Imagine trying to look for that in the fossil record. However, people have made their entire career trying to figure out what the oldest evidence of life happens to be. Now, I've said it before, and I'll say it again. If you guys ever invent a time machine, be careful how far back you go. Because approximately 3.5 billion years ago, when life was starting to come about, the Earth was incredibly different than it is now. There was no oxygen in the atmosphere, or nothing substantial that would support us, okay? It was a very hot place, a very violent place, with regards to asteroids slamming into the Earth and so forth. And there were a lot of noxious gases in the atmosphere, and you wouldn't be able to breathe. All right, so very, different back then than it is today, thankfully. So when it comes to the rocks at Warrawoona and the oldest outcrop, the thing to keep in mind, several things actually. Most of the rock is volcanic, okay, with only a few sedimentary deposits. You can imagine if it's volcanic, what type is that? Igneous is Latin for fire, so it's igneous rock, right? If it's volcanic, you can imagine there's not a lot of fossils in there, okay? And in fact, 95% of the area consists of lava flow. That's not much room for fossils, all right? However, 5% of the sediments are mostly preserved as dark cherts. They were accumulated in basins among the dark volcanic rock, and that is where some of the oldest rocks from the Earth exist today. Okay, so just keep in mind that there's not a lot of them, but what's there is pretty interesting. When it comes to what was in those early rocks, okay, we do not have a complete picture at all. We don't even have close to a big picture, okay? So what I'm going to do is describe what we do know about the rocks, keeping in mind it's like pieces of a puzzle when 99% of the puzzle's missing. Okay, so what I'm wanting you to get from this are, what exists at Warrawoona. There's a series of types of rocks that do, and we'll talk about them, okay? Realizing that, again, this is not a complete picture, okay? So first off, at Warrawoona, they detected chert, okay? Chert is a hard sedimentary rock. It includes all sorts of different kinds. They're very often can be dark colored in the color of the rock, and some of the darker colored nodules can be called flint, okay? So again, keep in mind, this is just one thing that was found at Warrawoona, realizing this is just a piece of a really, really, really big puzzle. So remember the rocks at Warrawoona, the cherts, they're otherwise known as flints, okay? These are made up of silica, and they have interlocking crystals of quartz. They're often formed long ago when they were formed on the ocean floor as a gel-like goo, and then they were buried and exposed to heat and pressure. Now what's interesting is these do not form easily today. And so the question is why? Well, what's cool about this is that we have critters in the ocean now that actually soak all of that up and put it into their hard shells. So there really isn't any extra silica floating around that isn't taken up by life. So on that hand, on one level, that's actually pretty cool and interesting. Okay, so the number one thing you find so far at the Warrawoona site are cherts. Number two are ooids. Okay, so ooids are these really interesting, they're cyclical, tiny formations of crystals that form around what is potentially thought of as maybe bacteria. Okay, so now this might potentially be a sign of life, but might not, because other things can cause this to form. But what I want you to get out of this is they do have ooids that are located at Warrawoona, and it might potentially be a sign of life because very often they form around live critters, okay? So that's actually pretty interesting. So we've got our Warrawoona cherts, we've got ooids, okay, which again are concentrically laminated carbonate formed where particles are suspended and they form around those crystals. And so it's interesting because it might be a sign of biological life, but it might not. Okay, so the fun of science, maybe, maybe not. Welcome to science, guys. Now, the third thing that is found with regards to Warabuna is gypsum. So gypsum contains calcium and sulfur. It's generally used for making drywall these days, otherwise known as sheetrock. And it's interesting because they did actually find it in some of the oldest rocks, on Earth's surface. So that's actually pretty cool. All right, so what types of rocks are found at Warabuna so far? Number 1 is cherts. Okay, number 2 is ooids. Number 3 is gypsum. Number 4, they find what are called stromatolites, Stromatolites, also on slide 17 in the next 2 slides. Okay, so the stromatolites are interesting because stromatolites exist today. Okay, and what they are they're mats of bacteria that grow in sort of a dome shape where they get mud that piles on top of them and then they grow some more and I'll explain it more in a few slides. But potentially stromatolites are evidence of life, okay, with regards to bacteria, which is pretty awesome. Now again, keep in mind it's controversial, but interesting and potentially suggestive of life back in the day. So here we have, this is the location where the stromatolites are formed. You can actually see the stromatolites on the upper right, okay? And so these are generally made by cyanobacteria, which photosynthesize, by the way, and are among the oldest fossils on the Earth, potentially about 3 billion years old. So think about it, guys. That's pretty awesome as far as life is concerned. If life is really that old, that's pretty amazing. So when you have stromatolites, you can basically see these laminations in sedimentary rock. And so they tend to be bowed upward like a dome or a cone. Okay, and so, by the way, stromatolites are trace fossils because the bacteria is not there anymore, but the stromatolites are suggestive that they were at one time. The reason we know so much about stromatolites, by the way, is they exist today. Okay, so this is on my bucket list. Before I die, I want to go see some stromatolites. Teach about these things, I want to actually get to see them, all right? And so the way it works is the stromatolites have several different layers of bacteria that each have different jobs, which is pretty cool. And so the stromatolites, the bacteria at the very top is the cyanobacteria, and that photosynthesizes, okay? So the cyanobacteria will grow and photosynthesize, and they form dense mats on the top of that, those stromatolites. That's where they'll thrive, okay? So grazing animals, the water's too salty for them, so they get to live a relatively happy life. So the cyanobacteria at the top will secrete a slime, and this contains polysaccharides, and that protects them against radiation of the sun, okay? The slime also allows the bacteria to stick to the surface, and so they kind of form this consortium inside the slime coat. But then things get interesting because the sediment will get thrown up from the waves and it'll stick to the slime. Well, eventually that covers up the bacteria, okay? However, the bacteria quickly slide and grow through the sediments back to the light, and they trap the sediment as they do so, and then the cycle repeats itself, okay? But this is how the sediment gets built up in those mounds, in those growing mats, okay? And that's when you look at the fossils and you see those mounds, that's what you're looking at, which is pretty cool. So when the cyanobacteria grow through the sediment, they form these mound-like structures. The particles of sediment get bound together, and that results in multiple layers, okay? Over time, this can harden to form rocks, in which case then the structures might look, might even be from an inch to several feet in diameter. So these things can actually get pretty big. Now this is the super, super cool part, okay? So underneath that layer is a zone where light is too low to allow photosynthesis. So that's where the organotroph bacteria live. Okay, so those guys live off the drying and dead remains of the bacteria above. And in fact, you can actually have up to 8 different zones in a stromatolite where oxygen levels can vary within a fraction of a milliliter. So you have all these different types of bacteria living in this like tiny little ecosystem. Okay, so the stromatolites are not just remains of simple bacteria mats, but they're basically like this complex miniature ecosystem that was teeming with life at one point. You got to admit, that is so cool. Now, as with everything else in science, it's controversial. Okay, so there's a lot of people that want to know if the laminations at Warrawoona were really stromatolites, were they really accumulating biological, fossils. You can technically get these features without bacteria, okay? And remember, what they want really is evidence of life. So realistically speaking, researchers are still looking for microscopic evidence, okay? And the data for this, of course, is going to be controversial because that's what always happens. So remember, the question is how old can you go with life? And whoever finds the oldest, that's what their career is basically based on. And so, everybody's trying to figure out how old can you go and find solid evidence of life. So this brings about the question, are the Warrawoona rocks truly evidence of early life? Maybe, maybe not. It's going to take a lot more investigation, I'm afraid, before that answer truly is solved. Now, there are other stromatolite-looking fossils near Warrawoona, okay? And so they do resemble the shape that you get, when you have stromatolites. This potentially could be cyanobacteria, but is still going to be debated. So because of the fact this is still controversial, by the way, it could be cyanobacteria, it could be other types of bacteria, it could not be bacteria at all. That's something they're going to have to researchers are going to have to figure out. Again, this still is not by any means close to being solved. So let's go to a place where there is some pretty solid evidence for life, okay? And so this particular rock outcrop is known as Spitsbergen, and it will be spelled on the next slide if you haven't downloaded it already. S-P as in Paul, I-T-S, B as in boy, E-R, G as in Gary, E-N as in Nancy. Spitsbergen cherts, okay? They are approximately 600 to 800 million years old. You can see that they're found in this island, okay? And the map is in the map, of course, is located on the right, okay? And Spitsbergen is that tiny little island in the upper left corner of that, and that's where these cherts were initially found. So what's so special about these cherts, by the way, is they definitely have cyanobacteria fossils, okay? So that is strong evidence that blue-green algae existed and built the stromatolites between 600 and 800 million years ago. So this definitely was evidence that by this point in time there was life. Of course, we kind of know that. So if we know that we had life 600 to 800 million years ago, why do we care so much about Warrawoona? Well, remember, that was 3 billion years ago. Okay, so it was much older than that. And so, the question is, when did life really begin? That's what everybody wants to know. So scientists love to argue, not going to lie. I've seen many scientists that have argued. I tend to shy away from it, to be honest. It just gives me stress. However, when the initial study was conducted and researchers claimed that life began at Warrawoona 3 billion years ago, much to nobody's surprise, other scientists came along and said, no, you've got to be kidding. That's not evidence for life, okay? And so here we see a map of where Warrawoona is. We have some of the scientists above that are arguing back and forth. And then if you look down at the bottom, you see the fossils that they were using to classify this. And let's be honest, it's really hard to tell. Okay, first off, anything that's tiny is going to be very difficult to determine if it's a bacteria or not because you don't have a lot of detail. And so some other scientists came in and actually borrowed those very fossils, and they came up with a completely different conclusion. And so you don't have to know the people by any means, okay? But what I want you to know is that these fossils are controversial. Others said that, they look like simple, filaments from cyanobacteria. Others say that they basically look too long and stringy, and they thought they were just seeing organic matter that was, changed over time. So basically, they could never agree and really come up with a conclusion. And again, this is what you're looking at on the right. It's really hard to infer from that. So another scientist, Tom Woodwack, you don't have to know him again, but showed that the structures did actually contain organic material at the margins, suggesting they might be a microfossil. But again, this is not conclusive. Okay, so it's one more line of evidence. It's a little bit obscure and certainly not definitive by any means. Another way to potentially identify life is to use what's called isotope signatures, okay? And so what happens is very often when a critter is alive, and you have different isotopes of the same element, sometimes for whatever reason, one isotope element is preferred over another. Okay, so you'll have a much higher concentration of one than the other if there's evidence of life, and this is called fractionation. And in these particular fossils, another scientist found that C12-C13 ratios seem to differ, definitely showed fractionation, which might be, again, be evidence of life, but still it's a little sketchy because, it's an indirect line of evidence. It's still not really, conclusive. So in addition to carbon fractionation, we also had fractionation of sulfate and sulfide. So I don't know if you guys have ever seen fool's gold before. I have to admit, when I was young, I thought it was the coolest thing ever. I thought I was going to be rich. My parents would just chuckle, of course. Yeah, it was a long time ago. But anyway, there is some fractionation with regards to the sulfate that was found in this area as well. So sulfate is converted to hydrogen sulfide by sulfate-reducing bacteria. There seems to be biological sulfate reduction that shows a preference for S32 over S34, which means there was pyrite rich in S32 relative to the gypsum. This large fractionation suggests that maybe there was an early biosphere and maybe life was what was actually causing this particular pattern. So what this potentially suggests is that maybe there was a biological origin and that life really began about 3.5 billion years ago. And again, it's still hypothetical, it's still a hypothesis, but it definitely is interesting to think that life could really be that old. So there aren't many Cryptozoic rocks, as we said, and one location, of course, was in Australia, but another potential location that showed early life was actually in South Africa as well, which is nice because there's an independent area where scientists can go to learn about, the earliest rocks and what was found there. So there is a similar outcrop of rock at the Barberton mountain range, and that's near Kruger Park in South Africa. And actually, it's written on the next slide, so don't worry about spelling it. But what I want you to realize is this is the second line of evidence that seems to have very similar results as Warrawoona, and it's in a completely different area, which is, really, really cool. In fact, these rocks seem to be so similar that they might have formed parts of a single ancient terrain that was severed by plate tectonics, okay? So they both have stromatolites, this suggests photosynthesis, they both have organic matter, they also have spherical filamentous microstructures, basically that look like really tiny microfossils of early life. Okay, so what do we know so far? Well, the continents seem to have formed about 4.2 billion years ago. And there's some chemical details of the volcanic rock, and so, there was a lot of continental crust. The reality is very little of these continents remain, okay? So that suggests that they were recycled back into the mantle through tectonic processes, which is what we would expect. About 3.5 billion years ago, then, plate tectonics had already begun, okay? So that made a difference in where the continents were located. Something else to keep in mind, though, is by this time, photosynthesis had begun. Okay, and so remember, photosynthesis is a pretty complex process, and it's not like turning on a light switch that all of a sudden it was there. If photosynthetic critters were alive 3.5 billion years ago, that meant the true origin of life most likely happened way before then, which is so cool and actually really fascinating, because it suggests that life began really, really, really much earlier than we thought. So evidence for any photosynthetic microbes will kind of allow us to calibrate the tree of life because we know photosynthesis came late. Therefore, the microbes must have been around and already evolved a lot, okay? And so if photosynthesis bacteria were alive back then at least some of the archaea were alive back then too. How cool is that? Actual critters 3.5 billion years ago, if not older. Still don't go there, though, in the whole time machine thing, because remember, no oxygen. But anyway, would still be very interesting. So this brings about the next question, how old can you go? Okay, so what really is the oldest evidence of life? And of course, scientists are staking their entire career on this. One particular scientist, Stephen Mohenzis, this picture always makes me laugh because talk about having a posed picture. Anyway, he had a publication in Nature that suggested he found evidence for life older than 3.5 billion years. His evidence was suggesting 3.8 billion years. His rocks were found off of Greenland, okay, at Killia Island. 3.8 billion years old, but the reality was is these rocks have been altered by metamorphosis. You know what that means now, okay? Within the rocks, he found phosphates and he found graphites. All right, graphites are definitely evidence of life. They also found fractionation. But again, this is controversial because, there's really no solid fossil showing, with a sign saying life began here. Mohensis isn't the only person who's trying to discover what the oldest evidence of life is and staking his career on it. Minnick Rosning is as well. And he thinks that he found the oldest evidence of photosynthesis, and his rocks are approximately 3.7 billion years old. His fossils are located in southwestern Greenland. They contain abundant particles of graphite, which is generally formed by the heating of organic matter. Biology seems to be the simplest explanation. The reality is once again, no definitive fossil, bacteria, archaea with a sign saying life began here, okay? So what do I want you to know out of this lecture? Because I realize it's confusing. First off, I'd like you to know what the different pieces of the puzzle are for Warrawoona, okay? Graphite, stromatolites, ooids, all that other good stuff, okay? Just realizing that 99.9% of the puzzle's missing, okay? Secondly, a really great question to ask on the next quiz, hint, hint, might be, what is the oldest evidence of life that you feel is trustworthy? And then justify your answer. Boy, wouldn't that be a great quiz question? I think that would be an excellent quiz question. Okay. All right. So I know some of you are still focusing on the exam, and I would like you to continue to focus on that. So I'm going to only have one lecture for today. And if you guys have questions, of course, definitely let me know. I will address them the best I can. I'm usually not too far from email. And I will talk to you guys again on Monday. Stay safe and stay healthy.